Thank you, Kamala, and good morning, everyone. Well, I will just say ditto. I, I don't really know. I think you've put me in a horrible position where these two marvelous geniuses have, elucidated on all these wonderful solutions that will change our country and our region. And I'm left now to kind of scrape up a few crumbs to add. But I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts, if I may. And I'm very glad to be here, and my thanks for the invitation. So as your viewers and your audience know, I have the privilege of serving on the board of the Office of Procurement Regulation, and we are now coming to the end of our second year in office. And despite the absence of full proclamation of the legislation, the board has been working diligently to put all of the systems, infrastructure, guidelines, handbooks, etc. in place. There's been a significant amount of training of public officers. So we are really in anticipation of full proclamation. And I do think it's very important to get that message out. And I know that the chairman and the board have been doing this, because there is, again, a sense of, from the public's point of view, that what have you been doing for 2 years? So, we've been paying staff, we have offices that we're renting, obviously putting resources in place. So you're spending money from the public purse, and yet what's the outcome? And we feel that very keenly as the board of the Office of Procurement Regulation, who are supposed to be really the ones championing this legislation, but without full proclamation, we really do have our hands tied. And so an important message for us to get out is that we have been doing everything we can possibly do, including reporting, obviously budgeting, spend, all of that has been fully transparent. But one thing I wanted to say is that when we took office at the beginning of last year, last year, each of us made the commitment, in fact, it was really mandatory, that we would submit and sign up to the IPLA, that we would submit our documents every year. And I do appreciate what Professor Brooks said about the fact that it does really deter many good people from serving on state boards. I have a number of friends and business owners that would be a fantastic resource for state boards, but will not serve because of the requirements under the IPLA. And so we did make that pledge, and we as a board have every year fully complied. But in doing a bit of research on that particular piece of legislation, and it's obviously the importance of for public officers to complete and comply with the requirements under the Act, it's very important and interesting to note that when they first began publishing in the newspaper the number of non-compliant public officers, that was in 1998, was the very first time that they published a list. And of course, we all see them in the national newspapers. There were 8 names on the list. This is in 1998, which is itself 11 years after the Act was proclaimed. If you fast forward to 2018, 871 names. So it went from 8 names to 871 names in the space of 20 years. And then fast forward again to 2019, again, we're up at 841 names. Now, my question is, we publish the names in the paper. What does that do? Nobody is shamed by being shamed, it would seem. There is, according to the chairman of the commission, the Integrity Commission, there is then an increase in compliance. But why do we have to put your name in the paper for you to comply with legislation that you knew was a requirement for taking public office? And that distresses me, honestly, when I see the names, and of course we often see the same names year after year after year, and it speaks to what Dr. Farrell was talking about, that lack of enforcement. There is no consequence for non-compliance, really. You get your name in the paper, so what? We move on another day, we like it so. And so that's really heartbreaking, I think. And we at the OPR, just to say for the record, have committed and have complied with the IPLA, the full board, every year. And that's been an important sort of foundation for who we are as a board and our character and our integrity as a board. And indeed, I serve, as you heard, on a number of boards, and we try and bring this ideology to all of the boards, whether it's NGOs or state boards or even private boards. And one of the things I wanted to speak briefly to was with regards to the public service and public servants. And we think about corruption and, you know, we talk about these huge projects and of course the smaller projects. But take, for example, the experience with COVID, where a majority of the public service was sent to work at home, and a majority of the public service did no work at home, and yet still took full salaries. When there were hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs, closing their businesses, suffering in real terms. And yet for month after month, our public servants took a full month's wages, knowing full well they were not doing a full month's work. That to me is absolutely outrageous. And I know the Prime Minister has spoken to it briefly, but what is going to be done? What's the consequence going to be? How are we going to manage that, manage those people out of the public service? And I know that is a painful process. I know the industrial relations environment and how difficult that is. But to me, it has to be done. That cannot be allowed to stand in a time where the country is truly suffering, that we have an entire section of the population that is basically being paid a full wage for doing little to no work. There are exceptions, I grant you, but by and large, that's been the experience of citizens trying to access public services during COVID. So I would really like to call that particular issue to the fore for some immediate accountability, disciplinary protocols, performance management, because I think that cannot go unanswered, in my opinion. And then I want to speak to what was referenced by both of the previous presenters about the training of the workforce. And this, of course, goes to directors on boards, as well as public servants, anybody in public life. I really believe, and I'm a recruitment professional, as you know, that it begins with recruitment. And yes, we have to remove the nepotism and we have to remove the political influence and those things, but we need to do a much better job of screening, recruiting, lie detector testing, psychometric evaluations, trying to identify people's ethical orientation, customer service orientation, before they set foot in our building, in our ministry, on our board. So that screening of people and the recruitment pipeline and how people are screened is so critical. Now, it is challenging in a small country because you are working with limited resources, but there are many opportunities, I think now, again, maybe with COVID, that has been highlighted to recruit people from CARICOM, as opposed to just Trinidad and Tobago, to bring in the skills that we really need. But more than skills, it's that ethical orientation. How do we screen for that? Yes, I can train you on workshops and AML workshops every year and all of those things, but it doesn't help if that person is, you know, a bad egg or a rotten apple from the get-go. And lie detector testing is one simple solution. There's 1,000 things that we can do. So I really think we have to focus more on the recruitment and evaluation of our public servants, directors for boards, and anybody else obviously in public life. And finally, I want to refer to something that we hold very dear as Rotarians. And this is what we call our four-way test. And if anybody's watching who's a Rotarian will know that we are encouraged as Rotarians, because we are also business people and owners of enterprises, and many of us serve on other boards, to think before we do anything, before we say anything, to pass it through what we call the gates of the four-way test. And we have actually sent copies of this to public officials in the hope that it may influence some behavior. So the four-way test is, of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? And if we can start to build, not necessarily those exact words, but that mindset, is it fair to all concerned? Before I take an action, I say something, I do something, is it really going to be fair to everybody that's impacted by my action? And that's, I think, what public servants have to remember, is that they are servants. They are serving the public. If you're a director on a board, you're serving your shareholders, your stakeholders. And that service has to be infused with ethical behavior and ethical conduct, and of course, transparency, accountability, and some of these other things. So I think we could do far worse than adopting the four-way test for all of our boards, all of our public servants. Certainly our politicians would be amazing. And my question to the Corporate Governance Institute and to everybody here is, you know, we are really preaching to the choir. I am sure that everybody who's listening, everybody who's watching, knows these things, understands and agrees with. How do we change, really change Trinidad? Laws are fine, but we don't enforce them, or it takes 20 years to get justice. We're recruiting from a small pool of people. We move the same people around and around and around. You know, it is so much an endemic part of our system. How do we really get our politicians to change, our public servants to change? There's a lot of great ideas. There's a lot of great suggestions. But I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, but I really don't feel terribly optimistic that we're going to see the change that we need as a country unless we have radical reform of our political system. And that, I think, is maybe a 20, 30-year journey. But I'm definitely happy to be part of the solution, and will do what I can. And of course, the OPR is very much part of that fight for a cleaner, brighter Trinidad and Tobago. My thanks.